Hey, welcome to Talent Acquisition Trends and Strategy. I'm your host, James Mackey. We're really excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for supporting this show. We are currently number one for talent acquisition on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so we really appreciate your continued support. And if you feel like you're getting value from this show, we also would really appreciate some reviews on whatever platform you're listening to. And today we have a really exciting episode. We're talking with Michael Salamey. And Michael, I just want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. That's pretty awesome. Number one. Hopefully, you stay number one after this interview as well. So.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Right now, the viewership's actually growing 30% month over month, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I've listened to a few of the episodes, and I mean, some of them, like the one by Rahul, for example, like just what a masterclass on talent acquisition at scale. And I mean, I've learned a lot from the episodes I've listened to as well. So I appreciate you guys being out here.
Yeah, for sure. I would love to learn a little bit more about you, Michael. I want the audience to understand your perspective. So when you're giving your insights and what you're seeing out there, your perspective is obviously going to vary depending on you come from enterprise or growth stage company or startup. So we want to know a little bit about you. Do you mind providing like a 30 to 60 second overview on your role, the type of company, a little bit about your background? We can always, folks can always look you up on LinkedIn to learn, a lot more in depth, but just a high level intro would be really cool.
Sure. So yeah, I've been in HR for 20 something years, and been in all sizes and shapes of company. I've gone forwards and backwards in every direction in my career. So I've consulted independently. I've been in talent acquisition. I've been through the ringer in all the companies. Currently, I work for a company called ID Plans out of Tampa, Florida. Beautiful, sunny Tampa, Florida, and it's probably the coolest company I've ever had the pleasure of working with or for, and I've done both as a consultant and now as the chief people officer for the company. And what they do is provide data analytics and services for commercial real estate to provide them with to help them centralize and visualize every nuance of data they have about their company, about their commercial properties, so that they can collaborate internally within the organization, externally with suppliers and vendors to essentially maximize the profit and tenant experience for their properties. And we do that through human capital and pretty groundbreaking technology, including 3D cameras, drones, and everything in between. So,
okay, cool.
I get to have a lot of fun, play with a lot of cool toys, and I get the best of both worlds, tech and people.
That's great. That's great. And so just to dive into it, one of the first topics we have on here is how you look at the TA function from the perspective of a CPO. I would love to get your thoughts on how you go about building out the TA function and setting up your individual contributor recruiting team within that, being that I believe it's around an 80-person company or how big?
A little over 100 right now.
A little over 100. Okay, great. So being a 100-person organization in the CPO role, how do you think about structuring your talent acquisition team and your recruiting, the individual contributor recruiters?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because that's 100 employees. We actually have about half of that in contractors that we leverage as well. So we have kind of dual workforces at play here at any given time. And we constantly think about how we structure talent acquisition and recruitment in general. And we use a lot of different strategies to do it. One thing that we're concentrating on this year, for example, is looking at, as far as talent acquisition goes, what's important to our team members who we're acquiring. As far as career growth, like we live in a world now where the average tenure at a job is roughly 2 years, a little bit under 2 years. And so we know that the majority of our team members aren't going to retire here. So the question is, how can we, number one, bring the best talent in And then how can we make it a great experience for them as they transition out as well? And so this year, what we're doing is we're taking the org chart and looking at every single position on the org chart and every other position on that chart, and laying down the actual KSAs, that the knowledge, skills, abilities needed for every position, as well as the education requirements, and basically saying, like, if I come into this company at our entry level and I want to get to CEO, what is the path to get there? What skills and experiences do I need to gain? What education do I need? And to be able to lay that out across every function. So, and so as far as talent acquisition goes, that's kind of like not a normal thing to bring them into that conversation. But we feel if they understand that, they're going to understand the context for the company and the context for bringing in great people and identifying them as well. So yeah, that's kind of where we start.
Right. And that's in educating the recruiters on really getting them to be dialed in on exactly what is required of each, I suppose, role that's hired for to progress professionally, enables them to have more depth to the conversations that they're having with candidates, and probably increases candidate engagement along the way. I don't think that a ton of conversation, at least in-depth conversation, is happening around career tracking typically in the interview process. Maybe it's touched on, hey, you're an SDR here, and after a year and a half, you could become an AE. I don't think a lot of tactical conversation is happening on, these are the performance metrics, the KPIs, the objectives, the outcomes that you need to hit in order to make that happen. Maybe sometimes, but if it does happen at all, it's usually going to be down funnel with maybe a VP of the function lead. But it sounds like you're moving that conversation to the essentially more so the top of funnel and screening calls to drive candidate engagement, to ensure that top talent is proceeding down the funnel. So I think and I'm just like processing as you said what you said. So I'm just going to riff on this for one more second.
Go for it.
It's like, basically a lot of screening calls are run as this data collection set. And maybe that's not good enough. Maybe it's, hey, we need to collect data and insights for half the time, or maybe 2/3 of the time, but we need to reserve at least 10 minutes to not only sell the company and the leadership team, but to provide more depth into career tracking and who you can become over the next 2 years. And the last point that I'll make, and I learned this from Steve Cadigan, the first chief people officer of LinkedIn, is one of the best lessons he taught me was, we have to normalize asking questions. What does life look like after working here?
Brilliantly said. Yeah.
Right. Because it's like, I always find it like the tenure conversation interesting. It's like people are obsessed on, how do we get people to stay here 5 years? It's, why are we trying to fight that current? How about we just build our organization in such a way to thrive with the reality of how things are actually progressing in the workplace, in the workforce. So
yeah, exactly right. I couldn't have said it better. Well, probably could say it better than Steve. So
yeah, no, for sure. No, I think that like it's a similar philosophy though. It's like you're being clear on who you can become, and you also have an expectation in your head that people aren't going to stay here 5 years. I interviewed somebody in season 1, and they were like, I was like, what does success look like for you when it comes to quality of hire? And she was like, if they stay here longer than 5 years. I'm like, more power to you. Like, if you can do that. But I was like, is that really happening? I mean, I respect that. It's not that I'm like saying don't strive for it, but also I just don't think it's actually realistic or achievable.
Yeah, agreed. And it's funny because we kind of also take the tack of it's probably a semantic debate of whether we're talking about recruiting or talent acquisition per se. But for us, we try to distinguish between them because I think there's a need for both. And I think in the industry, we kind of use the terms interchangeably and kind of casually, which is fine. But within the company, when we think of recruit versus acquire, we look at the roots of those words, and recruit is a military term that means enlist or enroll, and the distinction there is it requires marketing, right? Like be all you can be. We're going to pay for your education if you come in the company, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas acquire means to obtain, which is distinct to me because it requires intention. You have to go out and know what you're looking for to bring it in. And so, we try to be very conscious of that. And we, when we're trying to fill seats, we recruit. When we're trying to fill a position that we hope will be here for long term, or that's going to contribute in a larger way, then we definitely acquire and use talent acquisition in that regard.
Well, yeah, I think so. It's more so too, the talent acquisition function is, at least when done correctly, I ideally funneling up to a chief people officer role. I think that this is a good segue into our second bucket of the conversation, discussing potentially discrepancies between what the HR team is prioritizing versus what the executive team is prioritizing. And when you have a CPO at a leadership table, you have probably stronger alignment. And for what you're saying, talent acquisition being a more strategic function opposed to butts in the seat, really guiding what are the North Star metrics of our company. Is that, whether it be revenue growth or profitability, or defining clear unit economics, or defining clear scalable revenue channels, or whatever the North Star metrics are, to then align that with talent acquisition and the types of profiles that you need to pull in, both for leaders and individual contributors, to leaders to hit those key objectives and metrics, and then the individual contributors that could hit essentially the KPIs in order to make that happen. I'm curious to get your thoughts on if you feel like many times there's a disconnect between HR and executive teams, and what can be done to reconcile that disconnect, if you think there is one, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is one. Just speaking in the general sense. In fact, Sage people did a research recently where they spoke to 500 senior HR leaders and other executives within these mid-sized organizations globally. And they found that there was certain areas where the other C-suite leaders were not aligned with the HR leadership, which was really interesting because, of course, as everybody says, people are our most important asset. So if HR is not aligned with what the company is after, that's kind of a problem. So, for example, what was really fascinating to me was HR had talent management as the number one concern, and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, as the second most important conversation to be having over the next couple of years. But when you looked at the other executives, they definitely agreed that talent management was up there, but for DEI, it was placed at number 5 for them, and number 1 for the other executives was financial growth, actually tied with talent management. Financial growth for the HR teams was number 9. So I find that really fascinating. And if you look at the percentage of the respondents as well, it was 13% of the HR leaders said that financial growth was important at number 9, and 21% of executives said it was important at number 1. And so, when I talk to, whether you're in talent acquisition or just HR generally, when I talk to people who are asking for career advice, or, how to move up in HR and so forth, one of the things I tell them is you must go out of your way to understand the financials of the company. You have to know how the company makes money before you can roll out all the engagement programs. It's all about the strategy of what can we do versus what we want to do, because of course we want to do it all. But what we can do that aligns with the company's mission, vision, values, goals, and purpose are sometimes conflict. So we have to really be in alignment with that. And I think understanding how the company makes money is a great start for any HR person that's trying to move their way up to CPO or CHRO.
Right, and it looks like this study. So even at the CPO level, financial growth metrics came in at number 9, or was this primarily for HR teams where it's VP or only director level HR folks involved?
Yeah. So the exact question was, what should the top priorities be for HR leaders through 2024? And so they asked HR leaders, including CHROs and CPOs, and they asked other executives, so the C-suite,
Yeah.
basically.
I,
So
I think that would have been more valuable if they segmented out CPO from
yeah,
other HR leaders, like in situations where HR reports into a CFO or COO, because I feel like there's going to be a bigger disconnect there versus somebody that's a CPO that is actually on those executive meetings and on the board meetings.
yeah. To be fair to Sage people, they may have actually done that, in HR, ironically, because we're the ones that come up with all the position titles. But there is so much title, winding through each other. So a CPO at one company may be a VP of HR at another, maybe just an HR VP at another. So yeah, I think they probably did the best they could, but I don't know how in depth they went there.
Yeah, I think it's probably there's titles. There's definitely potentially some conflation there where it's not necessarily clear.
Yeah.
I think I do think, just from my own experience and working within over 150 companies at this point in time at Secure Vision, that having that CPO layer is critical for alignment.
Yeah.
HR and talent acquisition leaders, as you said, need to understand North Star metrics. And there's a few ways that you can learn those. Look up the top metrics that venture capital firms look for one example. Look up the top metrics that chief revenue officers, chief marketing officers are looking at. Everything from net revenue retention, gross revenue retention, revenue growth, understanding unit economics. These types of things are what, even like customer lifetime value or customer payback periods, customer acquisition costs. While these aren't directly correlated to what you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, they're going to help you get into the mind of the CEO and understand the core outcomes that need to be delivered. Not only is this what is required for you to be an effective CPO, it's also required for you to probably get to that level, or at least maximize your likelihood, because if a CEO and the executive team know that you understand the core business objectives, right, the OKRs of the organization, they're going to be more likely to put you in that executive role. And then basically that understanding of the financial aspect will help you drive strategy and how you approach the HR function and what you prioritize. And I am, I don't even know if I am a CEO. So
Right.
I do agree that financial management and people management are at the top of the pyramid. It's really hard to say which one is more important because both are freaking critical. I think that everything else does fall underneath that. And the reason being is that if the company isn't in a healthy financial position, then everything's at risk and you can't do anything else. You can't make DEI a priority if financial health isn't a priority. The parallel being our personal health. We can't make our kids a priority, our career a priority. We can't do anything else effectively if we are in a position where we don't take care of ourselves. When we are the best version of ourselves from a health perspective, we have the most to offer others. And I think that does the parallel into business is, I think, a direct correlation.
Yeah. It's the airplane analogy. Put the mask on your own on your own self before you put it on your kids.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there is really healthy alignment there.
Yeah.
And again, you need a CPO in order to do that. I think you start looking at a CPO when there are several functions that are reporting up through HR and talent acquisition. So when you have talent acquisition managers and you start to have a layered organization and you have HR and talent acquisition and you want that I suppose alignment with the other key executives, that's when you really need it. If you're like a 30-person company, you probably need a senior HR person, maybe an internal recruiter, like a talent acquisition manager that's still hands-on.
Mhm.
But as you start to get into scale, I think it's 50 to 75 employees, you really need to start thinking about onboarding a CPO.
Yeah, and there's different ways to go about that as well. The conversation becomes more relevant as to whether you want in-house HR versus a PEO model or some sort of fractional model, and where you want to go as a company, I think really comes into play there. And again, going back to just understanding the financial skills and analytical skills that are required to help the company reach its vision through its people is really where that comes into play. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact,
Sure.
in that same study, they'd also talked about the top 3 skills needed for HR, and when they asked the HR leaders what they believe the top 3 skills needed for HR the next couple of years would be, they said leadership and management, and teamwork, and coaching and training. But when they asked the executives, they agreed number 1 was leadership and management, but number 2 was financial skills, and number 3 was analytical skills. So again, just some general misalignment. But to your point, a solid CPO or CHRO should be walking in the door with some of those skills. So that's a definite advantage to going that route. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I could not agree more there. And I think that there's just probably even now still a bit of a lack on that. I think a lot of CPOs do have a solid grasp on talent management. They understand the trends, the cultural trends, the expectations that employees have, that candidates have. And I think they're generally pretty good at keeping a pulse on the feedback that the talent acquisition team is getting and the HR generalists are getting. But I don't necessarily, I think you're right. Like, I'm really happy you brought up this topic when it comes to potentially lack of alignment.
Yeah,
That's
it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And we're speaking of candidate and employee preferences. We're still seeing, I suppose, a bit of the evolution from remote to hybrid. I don't
Mhm.
think a whole lot of organizations are going back full time in office, besides potentially more conservative industries, uh, old school industries like financial, right?
Mhm.
Companies. But curious to get your thoughts on that. What are you seeing out there, and what's your take on what companies should be doing when it comes to remote versus hybrid versus full time in office?
Yeah, boy, that is the conversation right now, right? So it's really interesting. I think it's a fascinating conversation, and it's certainly an important one. And I think there's a few distinctions to make. Number one, Disney just announced that they're bringing everybody back to office. So that, which is uh, an interesting phenomenon in a way, because it provides other companies. Now you've got Disney, Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, and a lot of these other companies pulling people back in, Google. And I think that gives more companies a little bit more cover fire to pull people back in. Now, what we find though is the data tells us, study after study after study shows that remote workers tend to be more productive generally. However, traditional leadership, meaning senior leaders at most companies, are just more comfortable having people in office, and that is the debate that's going on. And so unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, the senior leadership team, the traditionalists are kind of, swinging back, especially as we get into economic crisis looming. They want to be in their comfort zone. So LinkedIn and Axios just put out a report noting that 50% of all applications on LinkedIn right now are for remote jobs, but only 15% of the job postings are for flexible work. I think that the conversation is really interesting, because we seem to be coming at this idea of remote work, flexible work, whatever you want to call it, as kind of a new phenomenon. But you have to remember, like back in the early 1900s, there were no cell phones, there were no fax machines, there was no beepers, no pagers, there was no way to get a hold of people. If you had a salesperson, they were 100% remote. It's not like this is a new phenomenon. This is actually circling back to a phenomenon that existed for most workers already almost 100 years ago. So
I hear you. And you're right. We are seeing a bigger push now. I feel like this topic was huge 6 months ago, and everybody was talking about like what the future looks like. And I think everybody got a little burnt out from talking about it. And now we are seeing a lot of companies start to push on this. In my opinion, the companies that are doing this primarily are companies that have leverage. They're providing an opportunity, whether it's from a brand recognition perspective, compensation, benefits, maybe all of those. They are offering top tier, and as a result, they have the leverage to pull people back. So for instance, it looks like, obviously most people have heard of Apple, right? Calling people back to office. We have Citigroup financial organization that's asking people to come back for office on a hybrid work schedule at a minimum. Disney, as you said, we have Goldman Sachs, another financial institution. So 2 out of 4 so far that I'm seeing. Google, right, has that brand recognition, is offering top tier compensation benefits. JP Morgan, another financial organization, right? Then another recent one, Starbucks corporate staff. Twitter, Elon Musk, not surprising, has asked people to come back or give their resignation. And Uber, at least half of the they're requiring a hybrid schedule for at least 50% of employees to come back in office. So it seems like all these companies are pushing, and I would say that all of these are household names, probably pay very well, at least most of them. They have the leverage over employees to start to pull them back in. And I think that's why, versus maybe companies our size, right? We're probably going to be a little bit more flexible.
Yeah, no, if we want to, quote unquote, win the war for talent, which is never ending, we definitely have to be more flexible and be willing to offer flexibility. And at this point, like it's proven it can work. There are plenty of very successful remote companies. So, there's no more a question of whether it's feasible. It's now just a question of whether it's practical or whether it's a strategy for your particular company.
What do you think about like the argument for creativity? Collaboration.
Yeah, that's kind of Disney's argument, right? Is that more people together in a room equals more creativity, which there may be some truth to that. The psychology shows that there is some truth to collaboration in real time is different than collaboration over the web. And we all talk about Zoom fatigue and how the brain has to process stuff over the web differently. In fact, on Zoom, here I am, being more conscious of where my hands are and what I'm doing with them, making sure I'm in the camera view and that I'm not super close to the camera or backed up so far away that you can't see me. And while trying to have a conversation, I've got all these social cues that I'm trying to pay attention to, and it's very taxing. And so Zoom fatigue, we know, is real. But what does that look like for creativity and collaboration? I think the jury is probably still out. There are definitely more people, let's take authors, for example, who are more creative on an individual basis, right? Even when you take authors of novels versus authors in a writing room, there's an argument on both sides. So in a TV writing room, they love the collaboration because they can riff on each other's ideas. But often you get some pretty bad TV shows, right? And it's often due to the writing. And the same is true on the individual side. You probably have a million books that didn't make it for every Harry Potter that comes through, right? So I think it's an interesting debate. I don't think it's solved yet, but I think that there's an argument on both sides, and it looks like all the data is kind of pointing to hybrid is probably the best way to go. But
I think so. So what do you like? So some of these companies, though, they have these situations in which they have 50% of staff that's in a local market because prior to COVID, they were in office. And then they're hiring new employees, or maybe and then during COVID is what I meant. So before COVID, they had people in market. Then during COVID, they started to hire in other markets as well, because the market was on fire
Mhm.
last year before all this stuff started, right? Whatever's happening in the world. So now they have people that are out of market, people that are in market. From an equity fairness perspective, how do you balance that? You want people to come back into hybrid. You have other folks that live out of state. What are companies supposed to do in that situation?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any rote or right answers to those types of questions yet. I mean, as far as equity goes, this is a huge question, because you're seeing the pay transparency laws, coming across states like California and New York, and even some cities, like Chicago, are invoking their own pay transparency rules and so forth. So I think that it's a real conundrum for some companies, particularly companies that aren't what you call conscious capitalist companies, where the C-suite can make 100 and plus times more than the average employee salary. So the pay transparency is really a great example of where that's coming into play. And then from a talent acquisition standpoint, how do you hire that way? It definitely costs more to live in Chicago than it does to live in I don't know, Warrendale, Michigan, right? So
Right.
So do you pay the same rate across all states, and let alone if you're international, then you've got even more questions for pay equity there. So I think those are all very important and interesting conversations to have. I don't know if there's any real solid answers on that yet, but we're all trying to figure our way through this, and I think that a lot of us forget that we're still trying to figure our way through this, and everybody wants these straightforward answers. And we're very clear with our team members that hey, we're trying stuff. The company is owned and run by humans, so we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to keep trying to get better, and that's mainly our philosophy. So we experiment with all of those. So yeah.
You bring up a really good point. It's not just about in office versus remote flexibility equity, but pay equity.
Yeah.
And when you hire people in different markets, should that impact compensation? I personally, I don't think that there's one answer that is necessarily gets it 100% right. Because I could see the idea of equity or fairness. I could see somebody making an argument for different pay rates as well as for the same pay rate. And either way, you're going to piss off some people,
Yeah,
honestly.
exactly right.
So, because they're not going to have that executive perspective, and you can't necessarily expect them to, right? Like, I think employee surveys and having conversations with individual contributors is important. You implement the feedback that you can, but there's just some feedback that okay, I get it, but this isn't going to work for us at scale. And so we can't implement it. And then it just becomes a communication feedback explaining why, while it's a great idea potentially, or that you at least understand it, it's not actually going to be obtainable. In relation to pay equity, I typically just recommend pay everybody the same within the United States. Because it keeps, because like there's several reasons. From an executive perspective, it's easier. You have very clear salary bands that are based on experience. People get to, particularly if it's remote, you get to choose where you live. And I know I don't know, maybe some people don't agree with that. However, right, I mean, if you're in New York and you want to live in a low cost area, you could move. And I understand people may not necessarily always have that option. But I still think it's a little bit cleaner and easier to scale. And I think between the two options, it's the better one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I recommend it for every company, but that is the tack that we take as well. And we find that it just from a management perspective, it's a lot easier to manage that way. And we don't necessarily choose where somebody lives, but they did choose to accept the position if they accepted it. So
that's another great point, right? I mean, this is a two-way partnership, and you accepted the role at that price point. And there are plenty of companies that are going to base it off market. We end up basing it, though, primarily off the highest markets when we can, because typically, at least for our customers that are in the tech industry, the biggest candidate pools are going to still be in those markets, even though it's dispersing quite rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have
When we do our compensation analyses, we're looking at national averages mostly, and then we also try to compare them with companies of similar sizes, which isn't always easy because there are some definite outliers. We cannot afford the salary that Microsoft can offer with total rewards. So we have to be very judicious in where we choose to land. So I can't say that we always get it right, but we always try.
Yeah, you can't always get it right. You just can't. And that's what's also tricky about working with people, is that it's not, well, every function is difficult. Being an executive leader in every single function is hard. The trick with what we do is you're dealing with people, and it's messy. And you try to put organization, structure, process around it. But many times we are faced with decisions where there's not exactly a clear path forward. You have to pick, it's compromising, and it's deciding, okay, based on the situation and the data I have, what do I feel is going to create less friction? There's typically always going to be friction in a people function to some extent, but what's going to create less friction so that we can focus on the executive objectives that we need to, right?
Yeah, exactly. And particularly at the entry levels or even up to mid-level manager, there's a I guess a delineation line between how employees see the company versus how executives who are also employees see the company. And a lot of that is, as much as companies value transparency, we're definitely among them. We try to be as transparent as possible, but there's always a struggle point where, how transparent do you want to be? I can't teach somebody, I can't provide them with an MBA in 20 minutes of conversation to teach the financials of the business. But, what I can do is try to break it down into like, okay, look, I know you want better benefits, or you want more time off or more pay or whatever it is that you think we should do. And when an employee looks at the company's profits, they see a company made, $300 million this year. Where's my cut is kind of, what they think. And I always try to break it down and say, look, there's like 3 buckets. Okay. And you got money in each of these 3 buckets. And one of them is, pay and benefits. And one of them is overhead, and one of them is equipment and supplies, right? So, you got to keep the lights on, you have to provide new tech, and you have to, keep people happy and able to put food on their table. So if you want us to put money in more money in one of these buckets, which bucket do you want to take it out of? Do you want worse equipment? We provide you with an iPad. We can just get you, a tablet from Walmart if you want their version. Or, do you want less time off? Like, where do you want these buckets? How do you want these buckets to work? And then also trying to explain that, we also have to protect against, future calamity as well. So sure, the company made 300 million in gross revenue, but net revenue was considerably less. And, when you look at the coming economic downturn, which is, almost certain, how many people do you want to let go at that point? Because we gave everybody a raise this year. Where do you want to draw the line?
Yeah, and that's something that I quite honestly, I don't even go into as much detail. I don't, because I think a lot of folks are just not going to understand,
right?
Or they don't want to understand. I mean, I own an embedded recruiting company, and internal recruiters, agency recruiters, they're many times the first to go when a downturn happens. And so we're the first to go, we're the first to come back. So we're actually a great market indicator.
That's
and, we, like every other company in my industry, we had to let some folks go. And it was hard. And we explained the financial situation. Like, look, we need to run the business in a sustainable way. There's no way around this. This just has to happen. It's not a choice. This is the reality. But, folks don't get that. There's always like, well, a lot of them do. Let me correct that. Most of them do. A couple of them, they're going to go the path of, say, financial mismanagement, this, that, and the other, right? They want all the benefits and the flexibility and the salary, and they don't understand, like, on the other side of that, there's a P&L that's attached to that. And I do think that that is a common misconception of what we're seeing on the market, because all of the biggest, best management teams are going through layoffs. It's like, okay, when you're saying financial mismanagement, then explain how the best leadership teams in the world, is everybody just shitty at leadership?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, because that's kind of like, okay, that's not how the economy works, right? But people aren't going to get it. And so what I try to focus on is more so like, okay, what are the OKRs and the North Star metrics that on an annual basis that need to be achieved by the leadership team? And then how do we cascade that down to an individual contributor level so that they understand the activities that need to happen to reach their quotas or outcomes that they need to produce. And they also need to be aware of what the North Star metrics are. And that's where I focus a lot of my attention. And I am happy to explain in an all hands meeting what is going on with the economy. And then from there, I have to let people form their own opinion. And that's basically what I share with other executives. Like, on a one-on-one basis, I'm probably not going to get too far into it, but on an all hands, we could say, this is what's happening with the economy. This is how it's impacting our business. This is how it's impacting the North Star metrics we're trying to hit. This is what we can do in terms of cascading down on an individual contributor level to try to maintain the business where it is. And then we try to be transparent with, okay, what does job security look like, or whatever else is happening in the economy, right? Like, what do we think is going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months in our business? And we try to predict as well as anybody else can, but it's also what's hard in leadership too. It's like, we don't have a crystal ball, and things are changing so rapidly in the economy that it's like, nobody knows exactly where bottom is, what recovery is going to look like. We could all, and but then it sounds like an echo chamber, because then, like, within different industries and communities, people end up saying like all the same stuff because they've heard it from a ton of other leaders, right? So it's like, is that really an individual thought, or are we just kind of all repeating the same shit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. They've heard it so many times already from so many other sources. It does sound like an echo chamber. And I think of that a lot as kind of like the Glassdoor reviews, right? Like, employees will always blame management to some degree for whatever. And sometimes there's veracity to it, but sometimes there isn't. And I always think about it like, think about the last time you went to, Target or Walmart or wherever you do your daily grocery shopping. You probably walked in, you probably found what you came for, probably got out and went to your car, went home, put the groceries away. But what you didn't do was then jump on Glassdoor and write, this glowing review of like, wow, I went to Target today and I found stuff at a reasonable price and the checkout was really good and I had no problems. I got my change right. It was fantastic. But the first time something goes wrong at Target, you tell like everybody and their mother about the attitude of that cashier at Target and da. And, I think it's a lot of the same kind of phenomena. We tend to gravitate to the bad while really limiting the good things that we see. And I think as employees and even as executives, we kind of just focus on all the negative aspects and lower the volume on all the good stuff. So
right. I this is like a whole other conversation, but to me, it all comes down to accountability, and accountability is the number one trait of A players. The people that are the highest performing folks on my team take 100% accountability for outcomes. Now, the reality is that outcomes are not 100% in their control, but their psychology and mindset towards producing quality outcomes is extreme levels of accountability, self-awareness, investing in their own development, collaboration, teamwork. Like, that is their psychology toward life. And then you have folks that don't take as much ownership. And maybe they're more accurate. I don't know. But like, the reality is that you see the difference in terms of psychology and the outcomes that are produced as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that accountability is definitely up there as like probably one of the number one personality traits. I was reading this study recently about the number one predictor of overall job success today. And it was just really great. It was a study done by the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And it's funny, I'm gonna bury the lead for a second here, but I went around and asked people, said, other leaders in our organization, the managers of, teams and so forth. I say, what do you think is the number one predictor of job success here? And I'll get all kinds of answers. A lot of times it'd be emotional intelligence or IQ or, attendance, just showing up on time, integrity, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that 73.4% of employers in this research study cited that the number one predictor of job success was written communication skills. They ranked it, number three, next to leadership and teamwork. It was the third most important job predictor of success. So
Wow.
I thought that was just fascinating. And when I thought about it, it made sense because, we live in a world of Slack and Microsoft Teams and email. And the better you are at being able to articulate a message through email, text, what have you, with good vocabulary, with good grammar, with brevity, the more successful you're likely to be. And I just found that fascinating.
Brevity, I feel like, is very important.
Yes.
Yeah. It's if you can communicate a message clearly and in a simple way, I feel like that is paramount. I still find it interesting that's number one.
Number three. Sorry, number three.
Oh, sorry, number three. Okay, got it. Yeah, because that's okay. And then you said teamwork and leadership with okay,
Yep.
That makes sense to me. Let's go into teaching first-time hiring managers how to hire. One of the things that I put out on LinkedIn frequently, actually I should do a post on this today, is it doesn't matter how good your recruiters are if your hiring managers are not committed to hiring top talent or learning how to hire top talent, because we cannot control as recruiters and talent acquisition leaders if the function heads of other departments are going to follow through on the process and best practices that we outline. So how do you go about training first-time hiring managers to effectively engage with top talent? And I suppose the second part of that question would be, how do you get buy-in?
Yeah, buy-in is probably the more difficult part for sure. It's interesting though, like you kind of hit the nail on the head. It doesn't matter how good the recruitment or TA team is if the hiring manager doesn't know what they're actually looking for or what they want. And I wrote about this on LinkedIn a while ago, but when I was consulting a couple of years ago, I was helping this company build out their TA process. And I was watching these two interviews, and they had two people who were very similar experience-wise. And in one of these interviews, one of the people is just very gregarious and just a kind of a charmer, and did really well. And the other one was kind of almost a stereotype of an accountant, just very dry, no personality at all, like a doorknob, trying to get answers out of this person. And in the first interview, the hiring manager who was interviewing even pointed out, he said something to the effect of, well, you're clearly intelligent and have a good sense of humor. Those are two great qualities. Anyone goes on in the interview, and I noted this down, and they ended up passing on this person. They picked the other person because they had a degree. The irony was the degree was not in a field that had anything to do with what they were looking for. And then so I was debriefing with the executive team over this, and I said, let me ask you guys a question. I said, we had two applicants here, two candidates that had very similar experiences, almost identical work histories. One of them had a degree, one that was unrelated to what we're looking for. One of them didn't. But the hiring manager noted that the one was highly intelligent and had a good sense of humor. I said, so let me ask you, what does that mean to you when I say somebody's highly intelligent? They kind of went around round table, and And it turns out, well, you know, they can process and assimilate information. And I said, okay, so what does a good sense of humor mean? You know, they said, well, you know, they can take that information and they can turn it around. You know, you got to be quick-witted, so they have to process information quickly and turn it around and come up with a clever solution, right? And I was like, yeah, that's very good. So let me ask you this. Let me just see a show of hands around the executive team. Who doesn't want smart and funny on their team? There was, you know, silence, right? So, you know, and I just think that was an interesting thing. I said, if you don't know what you're looking for in a team member via personality or skills, how can you expect, you know, the recruiting or hiring team, you know what they're looking for? Let me ask you this. How many hiring managers before the interview actually read the job posting, the job description, and looked at the resume? Because that should happen before every interview. And again, crickets.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a really interesting thing, because I think that sometimes as hiring managers, we want to put the burden on the recruiting and talent acquisition team and forget that we actually have a role to play in the whole thing. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting.
I think that's what your one aspect is helping hiring managers work past unconscious biases.
Yeah, another big one.
They don't even know, like, well, even like with the degree thing. I mean, I think that we've grown up in a world a certain way that is not necessarily serving us today, and it's being adaptable and having folks that are forward thinking and self-aware and aware of what actually is producing outcomes versus things that do not, right? And I think that the degree aspect is critical to that. I think the other part in terms of getting buy-in for following process and best practices, the only way that I've seen this work is CPOs convincing other leaders to implement hiring performance metrics for every function lead company-wide. It needs to be a core part of the objective of what they need to accomplish in their role. They need to be accountable for their own hiring plan. It's not just talent acquisition that's accountable for the hiring plan.
Yeah.
It's impossible to achieve a hiring plan if you don't have buy-in from the folks that are actually hiring the people on their team.
Yeah, 100%. We still our position description philosophy from a gentleman named Mark Horstman, who ran a thing called Career Tools for years. But all of our position descriptions end with, what is the simplest, easiest way to tell if this person is doing a good job? And you have 3 to 5 things, and we use those as the key attributes for the job. And then in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, fantastic book, by the way, he tells a story about how he helped bridge the gap of the recruiting for I think it was the Israeli army. And he also talked about having 3 to, I think he says 6 key attributes for the job. And then he said, create questions that test those attributes. And I would add to that you also have to, when you create those questions, you have to know what a right answer looks like for those questions. And you have to know if you're asking what you think you're asking.
That's a great point. Like, I see a lot of I guess so there's like 3 tiers of competency. You have organizations that don't craft custom questions, that are just shooting from the hip. You have organizations that do craft custom questions. But I think even the ones that do craft custom questions are not necessarily thinking about, well, okay, what does a good answer look for? And I think with some questions, it's probably relatively straightforward, but with others, maybe not so much. So I think you're right, like going through the exercise of thinking, hey, what does good actually look like here? What are we looking for in these answers? And maybe that isn't happening all the time. You hope it is, but I guess you're right. That's not necessarily, we can't make the assumption that hiring managers actually are doing that all the time.
Well, I think even when you start with just the deal breakers, right? The pre-screen, I think a powerful pre-screen can do a lot of the heavy lifting for a solid TA team. And I sometimes see a hiring manager says, they absolutely need a bachelor in this position. I say, okay, hold on a second. Let me just make sure I'm understanding, because the ATS, this is a binary question. So are you telling me that somebody with 12 years of experience in X is out, even if they don't have a bachelor's. But somebody with 2 years of experience but has a bachelor's is in. Oh no, 12 years I'd consider, like, okay, so that's not a deal breaker. That's a nice to have. Let's go on to the next one. Yeah. And just helping them kind of understand what they're actually looking for. And also I find that a lot of, and this is not just a hiring manager, even some of our talent acquisition people, and I understand why it happens because it's very monotonous, but they don't always ask the same question the same way of every applicant. And I constantly coach that you have to do that. And a great example of that is sometimes you'll ask a question about, are you great at Excel? And, Excel has been around for almost 40 years. Everyone thinks they're great at Excel. Like, that's not a question, first of all. But you may ask that question of one person and they say, yeah, I use Excel every day at work. And you write down on your notes, knows Excel. And you ask the next candidate, hey, are you great at Excel? Like, pivot tables and things like that. And they say, oh yeah, I use pivot tables and data slicers, every day. I've got a fundamentals of Excel certification. And, I've been doing it for the last 5 years. I live in Excel. Okay, great. They would write down great at Excel, knows pivot tables and data slicers. A week later, when they're going back and looking at their notes, what happens a lot of times is they see one that says knows Excel, one that says great at Excel, knows data pivot tables and data slicers, and has a fundamentals of Excel certification. The first person may have had an advanced certification in Excel, may understand pivot tables, data slicers, if sum statements, and VLOOKUPs and about 20 other things, but you didn't ask them that question. You just asked if they're great at Excel.
Right. That's a very good point. And honestly, it's not actually something I've thought of. I know that it's important to ask the same questions, but you're right. You have to ask the same questions in the same way, because some questions might be a little bit more leading or specific that can lead to a more detailed answer. And of course, you're not going to remember off the top of your head a week later. And so you're right. I mean, assuming the hiring manager actually puts the feedback or puts the answers in the system,
right.
They're not actually going to be able to remember, and they're going to go off notes if particularly if they're interviewing a lot of candidates. And that can decide who moves forward in the interview process.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, for a first-time hiring manager, I always say, like, listen, as just a simple heuristic when you're interviewing, like, if I can't teach you anything else, or I don't have time to right now, I just want you to always be having these two questions in the back of your mind. Number one, would I like to go have dinner with this person, or if or would I like to have a beer with this person, or what have you? Because if the answer is yes, then they're probably keying in on the personality, right? Like, they're probably a team fit. If you want to learn more about this person, you find them engaging and interesting, they're probably a good fit for the team. And the second question I tell them, just think about in the back of your head is, can I see myself working for them one day? And if you can, you're probably keying in on a skill set, even if you didn't catch it in the interview questions. You probably got some hunch about it. Like, this person is sharp, they know what they're saying, they know what they're doing. So, like, if I can't teach you anything else, just focus on those two and give me some good notes.
I love it. I love it. Well, hey, Michael, this has been a blast. I appreciate your contribution on the show. It's because of folks like you that we're able to offer so much value to the community and be in the #1 spot for being the value-added show on the market right now. So thank you for coming on today, joining us and giving us a masterclass on your philosophy toward talent acquisition and people functions. We really appreciate you.
Such a pleasure. Congratulations on being #1, and hopefully that remains the case for a long time to come.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's because of folks like you. So I want to make sure that if people want to engage with you, they can find you online, assuming you want to be found, or you don't mind if people reach out. Where can people, how can people engage with you?
Sure. I'm Michael Salamey everywhere. You can just look me up on LinkedIn. It's probably the place where I engage the most. I don't do a lot on social media generally, because I usually head down trying to figure out strategic ways to help our company dominate the market. But but yeah, you can always find me on LinkedIn, or just Google my name and turn up everywhere.
I love it. I love it. Well, Michael, thank you. And for everybody tuning in, thank you for joining us, and we will talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks.